Why don't you head back to your cubicle, princess? Real operators are working here. The words dripped with mockery, echoing through the massive aircraft hangar. Laughter rippled through the assembled crowd, not quite malicious, but the kind of easy, complicit chuckling that creates belonging by excluding someone else. 300 of the nation's finest warriors stood watching. Delta Force operators, Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Air Force Pararescue. All of them turned toward the source of the derision. Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Kane stood at the center of attention, a figure carved from granite and arrogance. As the primary close-quarters combat instructor for this joint training evolution, Kane had earned his reputation through a decade of brutal efficiency in the world's most hostile environments. His shoulders were broad enough to block doorways, his hands scarred from 1,000 fights, and his voice carried the absolute certainty of a man who had never been proven wrong on a training mat. His target stood near the edge of the combat area, in a space typically reserved for administrative personnel and observers. Lieutenant Sarah Chen was unremarkable in every way these warriors considered remarkable. Where they were chiseled muscle and combat-hardened intensity, she was of modest stature with an almost scholarly appearance. Her uniform fit properly, but without the tailored precision that suggested vanity. Dark hair was pulled into a regulation bun, revealing features that were pleasant but forgettable, the kind of face that disappeared in a crowd. She held a tactical planning folder, the quintessential symbol of the support world Kane had just ridiculed. She didn't flinch. She didn't blush. She didn't even acknowledge him. Her eyes remained fixed on the center of the training mat, her expression as still as glass. Her silence created a strange density in the suddenly noisy room. It wasn't fear or intimidation. It felt more like deliberate absence, a void of reaction. In a space crackling with testosterone and contempt. From an elevated observation deck overlooking the training floor, Brigadier General Patricia Reeves watched the scene develop, her jaw tightening. Reeves was a living legend in special operations circles, a woman who had shattered glass ceilings in an era when they were reinforced with steel. She had commanded missions in theaters most civilians would never hear about. She recognized Kane's cheap showboating and was preparing to intervene, to shut down this unprofessional display before it escalated further. But then she noticed something. She saw the way Chen was standing. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone without extensive hand-to-hand combat training. But to Reeves, it was unmistakable. Chen's feet weren't positioned in the standard at-ease stance. They were placed with mathematical precision, weight distributed not evenly, but with a calculated forward bias, creating a foundation of coiled readiness. Her shoulders appeared relaxed, hands resting naturally at her sides. The folder held in her right hand not as protection, but as an object whose weight and balance had already been incorporated into her center of mass. It was a posture of dangerous, patient stillness. It was something Reeves had only seen a handful of times in her 30-year career. The general leaned forward, her reprimand forgotten. This was no longer about a bully and his target. Something significant was about to unfold. If you believe true strength doesn't need to announce its presence, remember this moment. The laughter faded, replaced by anticipation. A collective curiosity about how this unassuming officer would respond to public humiliation. Gunnery Sergeant Kane, feeding off the attention, clearly interpreted her silence as capitulation. He saw a timid staff officer frozen by the spotlight and decided to transform this into a teaching moment for the operators under his instruction. "What's wrong? Forget how to talk," he boomed, taking an aggressive step toward her. "Look, I understand. You're a 14 Foxtrot, a human intelligence specialist. Your battles are fought with databases and debrief forms. But out here in the operational world, combat readiness is paramount. Every person on this base, from supply clerks to the commanding general, needs to be a warrior first. You look like you couldn't fight your way past a firmly worded email." He was now standing directly before her, his shadow engulfing her smaller frame. He gestured broadly to the assembled warriors. "You see this, people? This is what complacency looks like. This is what happens when we lose our edge, when people forget we're downrange every day. They hide behind laptops, lose their warrior spirit, and become vulnerabilities waiting to be exploited." Lieutenant Chen finally lifted her head. Her eyes, a cool, unremarkable brown, met his. There was no fear in them, no anger, no emotion whatsoever. And that emptiness disturbed Kane. more than any defiance could have. "I am not a vulnerability, Gunnery Sergeant," she said. Her voice was quiet, clear, and completely devoid of inflection. It was a statement of objective fact. Kane scoffed, a harsh sound. "Prove it," he challenged, his voice thick with contempt. "Right here, right now? Step onto the mat. I won't hurt you. I'll just demonstrate to everyone here the difference between a real operator and a staff officer playing dress-up." He gestured to the open training area like a king granting audience to a peasant. The crowd murmured, a mixture of excitement and unease. This had crossed from casual mockery into formal public challenge. General Reeves remained motionless on her observation deck, her gaze locked on Chen. She recognized the trap Kane was constructing, but she also recognized the complete absence of hesitation in the lieutenant's posture. Chen placed her folder carefully on a nearby equipment bench, her movements economical and precise. She walked onto the mat, her boots making no sound on the padded surface. She stood in the center, facing the imposing instructor, and simply waited. She didn't raise her hands. She didn't adopt any recognizable fighting stance. She just stood there, a picture of serene composure, her hands relaxed at her sides. Her stillness was an answer itself, a silent contradiction to his loud aggression. And in that profound silence, the balance of power in the room began shifting, tilting away from the loud, arrogant man and toward the quiet, enigmatic woman. The very air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable collision. The hangar had become a pressure cooker of anticipation. 300 elite soldiers, men and women who lived and breathed controlled violence, were utterly captivated. They had expected Chen to refuse, to stammer an excuse, to be rescued by an intervening officer. But there she stood, alone, a still figure in the center of the arena, facing a man who outweighed her by at least 80 pounds of combat-hardened muscle. Kane circled her like a predator, a smirk plastered across his face. He was performing for the crowd, transforming the demonstration into theater. "All right, princess," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. "Let's start simple. Basic defensive posture. Hands up. Like this." He raised his own massive fists in an exaggerated boxing stance, drawing chuckles from the assembled troops. Lieutenant Chen didn't move. She simply tracked him with her eyes, following his every motion with unsettling placidity. Her stillness was beginning to affect him, eroding his confidence. He needed a reaction, a flicker of fear to validate his dominance. "Come on now. Don't just stand there like a mannequin. I'm going to approach you. I'll even tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to perform a simple collar tie. All you need to do is stop me. Just put your hands up and defend yourself." He spoke slowly, as if explaining rules to a child. He began moving toward her, deliberately telegraphing his intention. His right hand, a mass of scar tissue and calluses, reached for the collar of her uniform. He wasn't planning to strike. He was planning to humiliate, to control her, to drag her around the mat, and prove his point about strength and weakness. From her vantage point, General Reeves leaned forward, her knuckles white on the railing. She wasn't watching Kane. She was watching Chen's hands. They remained at her sides, but they were no longer completely relaxed. Her fingers had curled slightly, her thumbs resting against her forefingers. It was the configuration of a coiled spring, a system holding enormous potential energy in perfect equilibrium. The moment Kane's hand entered Chen's personal space, the world shifted into slow motion. It wasn't her hands that moved first. It was her hips, a subtle rotation of perhaps 2 degrees. It was a movement of pure efficiency, generating torque from the ground upward. As Kane's fingers brushed the fabric of her collar, her body finally released. It wasn't a block. Blocks are crude, inefficient contests of force against force. This was something entirely different. It was a symphony of leverage and timing. Her left hand, moving in a graceful arc, didn't meet his hand directly. It came up from beneath, cupping his elbow, her thumb finding the exact pressure point in the joint. Simultaneously, her right hand moved not to his wrist, but past it, her own wrist rotating to hook his from the outside. She hadn't stopped his momentum. She had joined it, redirected it, and amplified it. Kane felt a moment of confusion. His intended grab had missed, his arm suddenly guided along a trajectory he hadn't chosen. He felt no significant force from her, just a firm, insistent guidance. He tried to retract his arm, to muscle his way out of her control, but it was like fighting water. He was a powerhouse of strength, but his strength was irrelevant. She wasn't fighting his muscles. She was manipulating his skeletal structure. She continued the fluid rotation. Her body turned, her feet pivoted, and his arm twisted into an unnatural angle. A sharp, searing pain shot from his wrist to his shoulder. For the briefest instant, the entire hangar suspended in collective disbelief. The operators essay. Their formidable instructor, a man who could deadlift over 500 pounds, suddenly off balance, his arm contorted, his face a mask of shock. And then, with a final minute but brutally precise application of pressure, she completed the technique. The sound wasn't loud, but it was horrifyingly clear in the otherwise silent hangar. It was a wet, sickening snap, the sound of a thick branch breaking under immense pressure, the sound of bone yielding. Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Kane let out a strangled cry, half pain and half pure shock, and collapsed to the mat. He landed hard on his knees, his face pale, his left hand cradling his right arm, where his wrist now bent at an angle that violated human anatomy. The 300 elite soldiers stood as if transformed to stone. The air evacuated from the room, replaced by a vacuum of stunned, absolute silence. Laughter, arrogance, condescension, all of it vanished, incinerated in the space of a single heartbeat. Kane was on the ground, gasping, his bravado shattered, and Lieutenant Sarah Chen stood over him, not having moved more than a single step from her starting position. Her breathing was even, her expression unchanged. She looked down at the broken man at her feet with the same dispassionate calm with which she had observed everything moments earlier. The quiet professional had made her statement, not with words, but with a single, irrefutable act of supreme competence. The silence that followed was more powerful than any shout, a deafening testament to the reality that had just unfolded. Assumptions had been broken as surely as the bone in Kane's wrist. The silence held for what felt like an eternity, a thick, heavy blanket of awe and disbelief smothering the vast hangar. Every eye locked on the scene at the center of the mat. The massive instructor on his knees, whimpering in pain, and the slender, unassuming lieutenant standing over him, a monument to lethal calm. Then a new sound cut through the stillness, the measured, deliberate tread of boots descending metal stairs from the observation platform. General Reeves strode onto the mat, her presence radiating an authority that immediately commanded attention from every soldier in the room. The warriors instinctively straightened, their shock momentarily eclipsed by the arrival of the legendary officer. Reeves's face was an unreadable mask, her eyes hard as flint. She didn't spare a single glance for the moaning gunnery sergeant on the floor. Her path was direct, her focus singular. She walked straight to Lieutenant Chen. She stopped 3 feet in front of her, her gaze sweeping over Chen, not with judgment, but with profound, almost reverent recognition. She saw not a staff officer, but a weapon honed to perfection. She saw a kindred spirit. She turned her head slightly, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Major," she barked at her aide, who was hurrying to catch up with a tablet in hand. "Pull up Lieutenant Chen's service record. Full file, authorization Reeves Yankee 7. Unredact everything. Projected on the main displays." Immediately, the major's eyes widened at the authorization code. Yankee 7 was reserved for the deepest, most compartmented intelligence, the kind of information that existed in fewer than a dozen databases worldwide. He fumbled with the tablet, his fingers flying across the screen. A moment later, the 2 massive projection screens at the far end of the hangar, previously displaying training schedules, flickered to life. A standard military personnel file appeared, but it was unlike any they had ever seen. The fields for awards, deployments, and special qualifications were so densely packed with text they appeared as solid black bars. The information began scrolling slowly down the screen, each line more astonishing than the last. Name: Chen, Sarah L. Rank: Lieutenant. Primary MOS: 14F, Human Intelligence Collector. A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. Then the first addendum appeared. Classified Addendum, Unit Assignment. Special Operations Task Force, Direct Action Element. Assignment, Unit 23, The Wraiths. A collective intake of breath swept through the operators. Unit 23 wasn't just elite, it was legendary. a formation so classified that most intelligence professionals thought it was disinformation. The list continued, a litany of impossible achievements. Primary specialization, close quarters combat, tactical interrogation resistance, covert infiltration operations. The screen scrolled further, revealing a section labeled instructor certifications. The names were a blur of deadly acronyms and foreign disciplines. Krav Maga, Expert Level 6. Systema, Master Instructor. Marine Corps Martial Arts Program, 6th Degree Black Belt. Jiu-Jitsu, 5th Dan. Shadow Protocol Certified Master Instructor, one of 6 worldwide. The operators stared, their minds struggling to reconcile the woman standing before them with the legend materializing on the screen. The list of combat deployments came next. Operation Enduring Freedom, 7 tours. Operation Iraqi Freedom, 6 tours. Redacted Theater, 4 tours. Classified Operations, 11 documented actions. Then came the awards, a cascade of valor that stole the breath from every person in the room. The Navy Cross, for actions taken in, redacted, where Lieutenant Chen, alone and weaponless, neutralized 15 hostile combatants to protect a compromised reconnaissance team. The Silver Star, 3 oak leaf clusters, 4 separate acts of extraordinary gallantry against an armed enemy. The Bronze Star with Valor Device, 5 oak leaf clusters, 6 distinct instances of heroism in combat zones. The Purple Heart, 4 oak leaf clusters, wounded in action on 5 separate occasions. The list continued, a testament to a career spent in the darkest corners of the world, performing acts of incredible bravery and lethality, all while hidden behind the mundane cover of an intelligence officer. The hangar was now so quiet the hum of the ventilation system seemed deafening. The last line on the file read, Current status, evaluation assignment, Joint Special Operations Command role, doctrine assessment, and threat analysis. She wasn't just an observer. She was there to evaluate them. Having absorbed the information on the screen, General Reeves slowly turned her full attention back to Chen. She squared her shoulders, brought her heels together with a sharp click, and raised her hand in a slow, deliberate salute. It wasn't the perfunctory salute an officer gives a subordinate. It was a gesture of profound, unwavering respect, a salute from one warrior to another. Lieutenant Chen, her voice boomed, resonating off the hangar walls with deep respect. On behalf of this command, I apologize for the unprofessional and ignorant conduct displayed here today. There is no excuse for such a profound failure of judgment and situational awareness. She then lowered her salute and turned to face the 300 stunned operators. Her eyes were hard, her voice laced with controlled fury. Listen carefully, because I will say this only once. The greatest threat to any operator is not the enemy's weapon, it's your own assumptions. You looked at this lieutenant and you saw a staff officer. You judged her by her size, by her gender, by the job description on her uniform. You saw what you expected to see, and in doing so, you demonstrated a catastrophic failure of tactical intelligence. She paused, letting the weight of her words penetrate. I looked at Lieutenant Chen, and I saw a professional. Before that file ever appeared on those screens, I recognized it in her stance. That perfectly balanced, patient posture is the hallmark of the Shadow Protocol, a combat system developed by one of the most lethal warriors I ever knew, Colonel David Cross. He was killed in Ramadi 15 years ago. They say he only ever trained 6 people to mastery level. 6 shadows who could wall K into hell and emerge unscathed. Her gaze swept across the assembled warriors. You weren't just watching a lieutenant today. You witnessed a living legend. Gunnery Sergeant Kane, she said, finally looking down at the broken man, her voice dropping to ice. You didn't just disrespect a soldier. You challenged a national strategic asset. Medics, get him to the medical facility. Now, the validation was absolute. The revelation complete. In the space of 5 minutes, Lieutenant Sarah Chen had transformed from an object of ridicule to a figure of legend, her status cemented not by boasts or threats, but by the quiet, undeniable truth of her competence, validated by an authority no one dared question. The story of what happened in Hangar 12 spread through the base like wildfire. It traveled faster than official channels, carried on whispers, and all long before Kane had even been discharged from the base hospital. Soldiers and dining facilities 4 buildings away were already discussing it. They called it the silence, or the day the mountain fell. Every detail was magnified, every nuance analyzed. The grainy footage captured on several phones by operators who had initially been recording to mock her became the most sought-after file on the installation's network. It was shared, dissected, and rewatched until it achieved mythical status. In the footage, you could see the arrogance drain from Kane's face, replaced by confusion, then pain, then pure, unadulterated shock. But more compelling was Chun, her absolute calm, her fluid efficiency, the way she used Kane's own mass and momentum as weapons against him. It was a masterclass in a philosophy of combat most operators had only read about. It was the physical manifestation of maximum effect for minimum effort. The ripple effect was immediate and profound. The culture of casual, chest-thumping arrogance that Kane had cultivated among the training cadre was shattered overnight. A new, more cautious respect began permeating the command. Operators started looking at support personnel differently, wondering what hidden capabilities lay beneath the surface of a logistics officer, a signal specialist, or a medic. The incident forced a collective reevaluation of what a warrior truly looked like. It wasn't about physical imposing presence. It was about demonstrated competence and depth of skill. Gunnery Sergeant Kane was relieved of his duties as primary instructor. His career, once on an upward trajectory towards Sergeant Major, was effectively finished. But the experience changed him. Weeks later, his arm in a complex surgical cast, he was seen in the base library, not reading tactical magazines, but studying historical military philosophy. He read texts about legendary intelligence operatives and quiet professionals throughout history. One afternoon, he saw Lieutenant Chen walking across the training grounds. He hesitated, then straightened and walked toward her. He stood before her, his posture humbled, his eyes holding new, grudging respect. "Lieutenant," he began, his voice rough. I was wrong. What I did was inexcusable. I was arrogant and ignorant. I have no defense. I just wanted to apologize." Chen stopped and looked at him. Her brown eyes held no malice, no triumph. She simply nodded once. "Apology accepted, Gunnery Sergeant," she said. "Assumptions are heavy burdens. It's better to put them down." And with that, she continued on, leaving him standing there, a man humbled by truth, finally beginning to understand the lesson she had taught the entire command. Lieutenant Chen, for her part, deflected the sudden storm of attention with the same quiet efficiency she applied to everything. She became a reluctant icon, a living legend whispered about in operations centers and ready rooms. Young operators, their faces full of awe, would approach her, asking her to demonstrate the technique, to explain the move. She politely declined to repeat the specific action, but she was generous with her philosophy. One evening, a young Ranger lieutenant found her in a corner of the base gym, methodically practicing slow, deliberate movements that resembled Tai Chi more than combat training. "Lieutenant Chen," he asked tentatively. "I was there in the hangar. I've never seen anything like it. How did you do that? How did you stay so calm?" Chen finished her movement before turning to him. "There are 2 kinds of strength, Lieutenant," she explained, her voice low and even. "There's the strength to overpower. That kind is loud, exhausting, and breaks itself against things that are stronger. Then there's the strength to redirect. That kind is quiet, efficient, and uses the opponent's own force to defeat them. The first comes from ego. The second comes from understanding." She gestured to a training dummy. He saw a target. "I saw a system of levers and fulcrums. He wanted to fight. I simply solved a physics problem." Her words began circulating, becoming a new kind of doctrine. Her philosophy of quiet competence had more impact than any formal training evolution. She was teaching them to see the world not as a series of threats to be overpowered, but as a series of problems to be solved with intelligence and precision. The event created its own memorial. Someone printed a high-resolution still frame from the video, the exact moment before the break, where Chun was in perfect control, a picture of fluid grace, and Kane's face showed dawning horror. The photo was mounted in the main close-quarters combat training facility. Underneath it, an unknown WN hand had written a simple caption: "Assume nothing." The spot on the mat where Kane had fallen became significant ground. New trainees were told the story, and the area was unofficially named Chen's Corner. It was a constant physical reminder that the most dangerous person in the room is rarely the loudest, and that true respect is earned not through intimidation but through silent, undeniable demonstration of superior skill. The legend was no longer just a story. It had become part of the institution's very fabric. A year passed, seasons changed, and new soldiers cycled through the sprawling base. But the legacy of that day in Hangar 12 remained stronger than ever. It had become institutional lore, a foundational story told to every new class of special operations candidates on their first day of advanced combat training. The new lead instructor, a battle-hardened sergeant major with quiet intensity reminiscent of Chen herself, would begin every course the same way. She would gather the aspiring operators, a collection of the strongest, fastest, and most confident soldiers in the military, and direct their attention to the framed photograph on the wall. Before we learn how to fight, she would begin, her voice resonating with authority. We're going to learn how to see. Look at this picture. Tell me what you observe. The candidates would offer their observations, a small woman, a large man, a martial arts technique. You're seeing the surface, the instructor would reply. But you're not truly looking. You're viewing a moment that fundamentally transformed the culture of this command. The man on the ground was Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Kane, one of the most physically capable instructors we ever had. The woman is Lieutenant Sarah Chen. Her official assignment was Human Intelligence Specialist. Kane saw a staff officer. He made an assumption, and that assumption cost him his career. She would then walk them through the incident, not as gossip, but as a tactical case study. She broke down Chen's stance, the economy of her movement, the precise application of physics. She used it to teach core principles: leverage over strength, timing over speed, intelligence over aggression. Rule number 1 of asymmetric warfare, the instructor would declare, her eyes scanning the faces of new recruits, is that you never, ever underestimate your opponent. You don't know their background. You don't know their training. You don't know what capabilities they possess. The moment you assume you're superior, you've already lost. Lieutenant Chen didn't defeat Gunnery Sergeant Kane with a wrist lock. She defeated him with a superior mindset. He was loud. She was quiet. He was arrogant. She was humble. He was a bully. She was a professional. Your goal isn't to be the toughest person in the room. Your goal is to be the most competent. The story had become a powerful teaching instrument, its lesson woven into the DNA of the next generation of operators. It served as permanent inoculation against the kind of arrogance Kane had embodied. The true legacy of Lieutenant Sarah Chen wasn't the broken wrist or the viral video. It was the quiet shift in perspective she had inspired. It was the young Marine who now took time to consult with the quiet logistics officer, discovering she was a competitive strategy game champion and gaining new insights into operational planning. It was the SEAL team leader who, before a mission, consulted with a female intelligence analyst not just for her data, but for her perspective, valuing her intellect as much as any trigger puller's skills. Chen's single act of quiet competence had done more to foster genuine respect than 1,000 mandatory training briefs. She had proven, in the most visceral way possible, that worth is not determined by a label, a rank, or an appearance, but by demonstrated ability. She had taught an entire generation of warriors that silence is not weakness, that stillness is not fear, and that the most profound strength is the kind that doesn't feel compelled to announce itself. Years later, General Reeves, now retired and frequently asked about the most impressive soldier she had ever served with, would always tell the story of a quiet lieutenant who, in a single silent moment, reminded an entire military community of its core values. True legacy is not a name carved on a memorial or medals displayed in a case. It's not what you leave behind, but what continues forward because you were there. It's the standard you set, the lesson you teach, the quiet inspiration that encourages others to be more observant, more humble, and more professional. Sarah Chen left no statue, no building bearing her name. She simply left behind a better, smarter, and more respectful generation of warriors. Her legacy was silence, and it was deafening. Subscribe to The Final Watch for more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where silent professionalism defines true worth.